All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Creating Complex Chart Types with Python Figure Factories in Plotly. I'm Charley Ferrari. I lead the application engineering team at Plotly, and I'll be guiding you through this content today. So let's get started. I'll just share my screen. Cool. And let's go. So Plotly is a business intelligence-oriented web-based data visualization platform and used by several types of users, anywhere from analysts using our online chart editor and collaboration capabilities, all the way up to data scientists who may be using us in R, Python, or Matlab. We were founded in 2013, co-founded by physicists Jack Palmer and Alex Johnson, venture-backed. We're a team of 25 people in Montreal, and we are committed to the open source nature of Plotly. So Plotly.js is open source. What I'll be showing you today, the Python API is open source, Dash is open source. We really embrace the open source ethos at Plotly. And one of the best ways of thinking about Plotly is to think of it as an ecosystem. There are really an endless number of ways that you could use Plotly. You could go online and use the Chart Studio, just connect to databases, upload CSVs, and edit charts using a GUI. Or you could use it as a data scientist using the Plotly API. So you could imagine this sort of use case being more in tune with the machine learning and modeling workflow. And you're able to use the API via Python, Matlab, or R. Today we'll be focusing on the Python API. And you could also use it for web application development to really develop data-driven web apps using our Dash application framework. When comparing us with other BI companies out there, we have a niche in really serving data scientists who are operating with a high level of complexity. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, if you're the type of user who's in Python, Matlab, or R, you're really living in these environments, Plotly dovetails really nicely in these languages and really seamlessly allows you to create better visualizations. If after this webinar you have any further questions about Plotly, contact Rob Williams with any of those questions. So he's reachable at just rob@plotly. You could email sales@plotly as well, and you'll be able to get any of your questions answered. So with that, we'll just dive right into our content. So today we'll be focusing on using what are called figure factories. And figure factories specialize in creating more complex visualizations than you would otherwise expect looking at what's available in the Plotly library. So if you're using Plotly in Python, you already know that you're able to use it to create stunning visualizations. And if you're just building more standard plot types, so in this case, we're using the scatter module within graph objects. And scatter module could be used really to create several different plot types, anything really from points, anything involving points on an XY plane. So be it a scatter plot, a bubble plot, a line plot, which are just lines connecting points on a plane. And using this module, you're able to, so as an example here, you're able to create several different plot types with just that one module. And these are very straightforward plot types, really. If you're using Plotly, odds are this is, you're building graphs that look very similar to this. So, and a lot other than this is available out of the box: heat maps, pie charts, 3D visualizations. So, really these, what we call graph objects, you'll have several types of these graph objects, and they'll allow you to make different plot types. The base graph types, however, can be used to draw more complex visualizations. So the way to think of something like this is if you have your different plot types, and you can imagine a more complex plot type being composed of your of these elements. You're able to build more complex plot types. So as an example, you could think of a funnel chart. A funnel chart is something that's really used to monitor the sales pipeline. So you're able to visualize the start of what's called the pipeline when you're trying to get clients to notice your product. You are able to monitor several stages, looking at how many people are signing up for your products, how many people are signing up at specific levels, how many people are renewing. And by doing this sort of analysis, this is really fundamental to any sort of sales organization. So Plotly also has the capability to draw shapes on plots. So you're able to draw boxes to highlight things. You're able to draw several different types of shapes, just freehand, really. And you could use these as your sort of Plotly atoms to build something more complex. So in this case, we're going to just define some features about our visualization. We're going to be looking at different heights and of the sections that we're looking at, look at spaces between the sections. You'll see what I mean by these sections once we see the visualization completed. So we define a few helper variables, and what we're doing is we're going to be creating an array of shapes. So I'm just creating an empty array, and we're going to iterate through the phases that we're looking at, phases being the sales steps that I mentioned before, and we're going to create shapes based on each of those phases. The sort of shape that we're creating is what's called a path, and a path is really any sort of irregular polygon. So a rectangle is easier to create because it just has height and width. Lines are easier to create, but a path is what you would use to create something a bit more complex. And once again, you'll see once we view the finished result why that's what we're using. So we're creating each shape individually, and then we're going to append each shape to our array. We'll do some more information here about phase names and phase values. And then lastly, we'll create our visualization. So before, when we were building scatter plots, the data was really what was central. And for most visualizations, that is going to be the case with Plotly. But when drawing a funnel chart, we're focusing on the layout because we're building with these shapes. And really what matters is this right here, that we're just defining our shapes based on how we looped through, how we iterated our shapes previously. And once we do that, you could see a visualization like this that really clearly shows really clearly highlights specific points in the sales cycle. So if you look at this, you could see why we used paths. So because it's funnel shaped, we're drawing each section as trapezoids. So we're using paths to really draw these more irregular shapes. And you could also see that the slopes of the edges of the trapezoids are corresponding to different outcomes within each phase. In particular, you could see the sign-up phase is really where there's a, depending on the orientation you're looking at it, a low or a high slope. And it's really where things are thinning out. So we chose to highlight that as red. And we could look at each stage, and this really gives us a quick visual way of finding out where we need to divert resources. So if I saw this funnel chart and I were looking to make recommendations for a sales organization, I would focus on signups. And I would say, every place else, we're not really noticing that that many losses, but we're really noticing those losses with signups. If we could fix what's happening with signups, then everything that cascades afterwards is going to behave better as a result. We're going to keep these losses the same, but we're going to have more people funneling in, and that's going to mean better sales for our sales organization. So using a visualization like this, you're able to really easily see that. And this visualization, there's no Plotly chart type called funnel chart, but this is just sort of giving people inspiration to see that you could take these little, these smaller plot types, not smaller plot types, but these what you may think initially are unrelated plot types, use them as atoms to build something more complex. So one lesson to take out of this webinar is to not feel limited by what you see in the Plotly graph objects. If there's a shape that you're imagining that you think would be a useful way of displaying your data, Plotly could be used to build that. And this funnel chart shows you an example of how to do that. Now, it's great to build these sorts of sophisticated plot types using these more atomic elements of Plotly, but figure factories allow us to build these sorts of figures automatically. So to guide us through an example, let's just start with a simple heat map, a more straightforward example. Now, a heat map, we're just going to we just have a matrix of data, and we're going to color each of, this matrix will be viewed as a series of cells. We're going to color each of those cells based on what the values of the matrix are. So it's a really straightforward plot type. You just define your Z matrix, input that into Plotly. So you can see we're using the graph object heat map. We're not making any sort of layout changes to it. We're just sort of throwing the matrix and using Plotly defaults. And you can see we end up with something like this, where you could hover over each of these cells, see the X and Y position, see what the Z value is. So out of the box, you're able to get a lot of functionality with the plot type that you're choosing, in this case, a heat map. But perhaps you want to go a bit further. So one thing that might be useful in a heat map of this type would be to see the values drawn on top of each of the cells. And if you recall our earlier example using funnel charts, I'm sure you could begin to imagine how you would go about building something like this. You could use annotations to display those numbers. You could place those annotations on top of each of these cells, and you'll have what you want. You'll have your values being displayed on each of the cells. And something like that will work, but if you then think about how you would need to do that, there's more work than what we had to put in to make our funnel chart. You would need to place each of these annotations. You'd have to, if you want to center it, so you would need to sort of find out how you're placing these. it's not as straightforward as building something like the funnel chart, where really we were just iterating over a bunch of shapes and we were adding them sequentially. That's a bit easier to do. So it would be very time intensive. So this is where figure factories come in. So I have the exact same data, and the way I'm building it will look very similar. I just have my matrix. I'm just going to use that matrix. Everything else I'm going to set as default. But instead of just using a graph object, I'm using what's called a figure factory. So here I'm importing my figure factory here, and I'm using the function create annotated heat map to create an annotated heat map. And once I do that, you can see that all the work has been done for me. And not only that, but there were some things that I hadn't have even thought of when I was initially thinking about building a plot type like this. So first of all, you could see that the annotations are placed in the center of each of these cells. You could also see that the annotations are complementing the background colors. So some of the text is showing up as white, some of it is showing up as black, depending on what makes the most sense for the background color. So that's something that perhaps if I were building this from scratch, I would go through one iteration. I would notice that with these lighter cells, it looks weird having white text, and I may want to make that change going forward. So this is something that's all done for me automatically. There are several figure factories available within this package. So you could see a few of the different types of figure factories that are available. And if you're a heavier user of Plotly in Python, or Plotly anywhere really, you may notice that some of these plot types are have graduated to be graph objects, to be first level Plotly graph type. Plots, for example. These used to be more, these are box plots, but you're looking at a kernel density line instead of your just standard boxes. This was initially done with a figure factory, actually calculating the kernel density, but this was now made into a first level plot type. So now you don't need the figure factory to do it. But for anything else, you'll see the figure factory plot types here. So now for our next example, let's build a Gantt chart. And a Gantt chart is a really common chart for project management. So you're able to view different projects, view the timeframes of each of these projects, and be able to pretty quickly and visually see the implications of these times. So you use Gantt charts a lot for scheduling, for example, when you could think of it as Tetris pieces trying to make better, more efficient decisions. So similarly to before, we have a specific data format that we're using. In this case, we're using a list of dictionary records. And we're just going to input, and you could see, we just have our task, start and end. We're just going to enter this list of dictionaries into our create Gantt function. And similarly to before, we're just going to plot it out. So we have a Gantt chart here. We have the ability to hover over the start and end points. And this is a really easy way to make a more complex data visualization. I'm sure based off of what we went through previously, you could begin getting an idea of how something like this has been built. So a figure factory returns a Plotly figure just like any other. So if I'm looking at the figure that I created above here, you could see what's really going on behind the scenes. So we have a few scatter traces. You could see one of them over here. And these are corresponding to the start and end times of each of the projects. So for each thing, we're adding a separate. You see the y is just corresponding to the categorical variable of the job type. And then in addition, we also have shapes. And these shapes are what is really drawing these rectangles. So the hover, this is being shown by an underlying trace. And the boxes are the shapes. So the shapes are made to match the traces. And this is something where it's very helpful to have an automatic function that does that. Now, because Plotly figure factory, a figure created using the figure factory, is just any old Plotly figure, you're able to edit that figure depending on what you may want to do. So this is a good Gantt chart, but we may want to display more information on a Gantt chart. So one thing someone may want in a chart like this is the display of additional information on top of the bars. You can imagine something like this showing the status of the project. Was a project finished successfully, or was it not finished successfully? So when you're looking at things visually, you could get more of an idea of sort of how timeframes are relating to the success or failure of different projects. And something like that is done more easily than building a chart type of this sophistication from scratch. So we're just going to take that figure and we're going to edit it a bit. So what I'm doing is I'm creating a date midpoint. So we're just going to look at, we want the label to be centered within each of these bars. So I'm just doing that by taking the midpoint of the existing traces that we have. And I'm then appending them to this existing, this extra traces. So I'm iterating through each of our data traces, and I'm adding them to this extra traces. And then I'm doing some updates for the individual traces. And one of the reasons why we're doing this is the boxes are actually drawn on top of the traces. And what we want is we want the trace that's showing our text to show up above the boxes. And in order to do that, we need to make sure that the traces are still invisible. So once we do that, we update our traces, we extend our extra traces, we're making sure that the shapes are going to be below the markers so that we could see the text. And then once we do all of that, we could see very similar Gantt chart to what we had before, but we're displaying additional information. So with each of these, I'm now able to see, in this case, it's just dummy data, but you could see more information about these were this a real Gantt chart. You still preserve everything about the original Gantt chart, so I'm still able to hover over the start and end periods and get information about that. But I'm just adding some new information to it. So in this case, not only are you able to use figure factories to more efficiently build more complex chart types, but you're able to take a figure built through the figure factory and make it even more complex. And it's all done in a very straightforward process. So with that, that pretty much concludes our content, and we'll move on to some questions if anyone has them. So feel free to just ask questions in the chat. Or I see some questions showing up here. So one question, someone asked if this is going to be recorded. This is going to be recorded. So if you access this link after this webinar, you'll see a recording. And for the code, I will, I'll see what I could do about making sure the code is accessible. I think I'm able to add it as a link to the webinar, but we'll see what happens with the code. Perhaps we'll send it via email afterwards, but I'll make sure that this code can be accessible. Does anyone else have any questions? All right. Thank you so much for attending, and I hope you have a nice day.